So yeah, welcome to the final WiSTEM Connect series. Really looking forward to this. So so today we've got Can PeaceTech end conflict during COVID-19? And we're joined by Laura, Christine and Fiona. So this is part of the WiSTEM Connect series, and for anyone that's not actually attended any of these so far, this has been a series we started at the start of June, I think it was, or July, sorry. And it has just been, because everyone's kind of, their life's been turned upside down for coronavirus, we have decided to make this to sort of create some community and bring everyone together once a week to discuss different issues going on at the moment. So this is brought to you by Edinburgh University Women's STEM Society. So our aims are to promote, support and connect women in STEM, and this is what this is all about as well. So if you aren't already, you can keep up with us on social media through the tags on your screen. I think we'll just get started really. So before we begin, this is going to be co-chaired by myself and Elizabeth. Elizabeth is our founding president. So I don't know whether you just want to quickly introduce yourself, Elizabeth?
Sure, yeah, so my name's Elizabeth. I'm the founding president of the society, and I graduated in 2019 from the University of Edinburgh with my master's in chemistry. So today I'm joining from the US, and yeah, it's been really nice working alongside Sarah and the rest of the society to make these events happen. So really excited for this final event.
Great. And then we'll just let our panelists introduce themselves quickly as well before moving on to your presentations.
Hi, I'm Christine Bell. I'm a Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Edinburgh and a Director of the Political Settlement Research Programme that has the PeaceTech initiative that we'll be talking about today.
Hi everyone, I'm Fiona Knäussel. I graduated from a Law and International Relations degree from the University of Edinburgh in 2019, and since November last year, I've been a graduate fellow with the Political Settlements Research Programme, where I found my passion for peacebuilding technologies due to some early interests in coding and tech in general. And that's why I'm here today.
And I'm Laura Wise. I'm a research associate with the Political Settlements Research Programme at the School of Law since 2015. And prior to that, my background is in international politics and ethnic conflict.
Great, thank you guys. So we're just going to have some presentations from all our panelists, just describing a bit more about what they do. So I'll let them get started, and after that we're going to move on to some questions from us, and then we'll open it up to you guys. If any attendees have questions along the way, just put them in the chat and we'll make sure they get asked. So yeah, I'll just stop sharing, and Christine, if you want to start.
Okay. So it's very nice to be here. Thank you to Sarah and Elizabeth for inviting us. We're very excited to see you all. So I'll be introducing, in general terms, PeaceTech, why we got into it and what we're doing, and then Laura and Fiona are going to focus on some of our sort of PeaceTech initiatives in more detail. So from around 1990 onwards, the predominant type of conflict in the world has been conflict arising mostly within state borders, so not between two countries, but between often government forces and armed opponents of the government. And with the end of the Cold War, one of the most common ways of ending those conflicts was through negotiated settlement. So there's really only three different ways a conflict can end. Somebody can win and someone can lose. And an internal armed conflict are often very protracted because that doesn't tend to happen. Or they can fizzle out for different sorts of reasons, or the parties can negotiate a compromise, and that compromise focuses on often trying to bring the outsider groups into forms of government and trying to set a reform agenda in place. And often what the parties do is they reach a form of agreement, often formalised, looks quite legal, and signed by the different parties. And those agreements often put interests of armed actors up front. But of course, many other groups, in particular peacebuilding associations, women's groups, trade unions, broadly sort of pro-peace communities also try to influence those documents, because the documents form kind of forms of constitution almost, and power maps and agendas for change for the future. So they're quite important documents. So our sort of PeaceTech initiative has come out of a program of research that was really trying to research when and how parties to conflict negotiate ends to them. What are the agendas that bring them together? Who negotiates those agendas? Who's left out? Do the agendas stick? And one of the things which we did to do this was we collected all the peace documents in the world, and we used a very broad, from 1990 until present day, we used a very broad definition to look at not just the sort of comprehensive agreements that people agree, but all the agreements they make to try to get into talks, and then the agreements they make after to implement their agreements. And that has resulted in a database of I think over 1,800 documents in around 140 peace processes in the world. So it's really a very large scale phenomenon, because conflict is very prevalent. So PeaceTech as a phrase, you've maybe heard of FinTech or can't think of the other ones now, but PeaceTech is really just the use of technologies and innovative and creative technologies for the purposes of peace building. And peace building are really any activities taken to try to promote and create peace. And the primary peace builders are usually those living within the conflict. At any time in a conflict, there are usually multiple activities underway to try to resolve it. So today what we'll be showing you is several different things. I should sort of stress that this has been a learning curve for us, because you can hear from our backgrounds, we're not STEM in a pure way, but we all, I suppose, have in ways taken on product design roles and working very closely and trying to create the type of interdisciplinary collaborations to produce PeaceTech applications. So I'm just going to share quickly a couple of the things we'll be talking about to give you a sense of the breadth of the work before Laura and Fiona focus in on the two main ones. So the first is, this is our peace agreement database, which Laura will take you through. But here we have coded all the different peace agreements, who signed them, what types of issue they take. And then we started to extend that to get into working with data visualizers to try to, in a sense, make the data more accessible and return it to people. So we, for example, worked with some Yemeni groups and Yemeni researchers and created this nice timeline of the conflict where you can click through to the peace agreements. We also have a separate gender database, just looking at all the provisions dealing with women. And we've got, just coming on stream on Monday, in fact, a new amnesty database. So one of the controversial issues in peace negotiations is, do you forgive and forget the past? Do you hold people account for the past? And often states and armed actors give each other amnesties. And of course, often victims in conflict want to see forms of accountability. So we've created a database where we've collected all the amnesties and the processes that led to them. The other things we've been doing in the PeaceTech space are, we worked with UN Women to create a PeaceTech app, which Fiona will talk about, which was, again, giving accessibility to the gender provision. We've done a few other things that are still works in progress. Firstly, sorry, I have kids coming in and out. Firstly, we've created little bots to retweet Twitter, peace building Twitter tweets. And we've been doing a form of automatic, AI, to try to see could we code the agreements automatically in some way. So I'm going to, the last thing that Laura will also be showing is we've created on the Peace Agreements website an initiative to monitor all the different ceasefires that have been called during the COVID-19 period, and that's really where we got the title of the talk. So that's a sort of quick flavour of what we've been doing, but to give you a bit more detail, I'm going to pass on to Laura, I think. Yes.
Thanks, Christine. So yeah, as Christine said, I'm just going to talk everybody through briefly the PAX Peace Agreements database, because that's not only sort of where we initially get a lot of our data from that then feeds into these other forms of tech, but it's also one of the projects that has been combined with other data sets and other research projects on gender and women's inclusion in peace processes to form the PeaceFem app, which I'm going to talk us through as well. So I'll just share my screen. So this, as Christine said, this is the PAX Peace Agreements database with over 1,800 peace agreements from 1990 to mid-2020. And so what we do with those peace agreements, as Christine mentioned, the content of those agreements and the issues that are discussed and decisions made on what happens next with a lot of these issues, we qualitatively code for them. So what we do is, if we show through Liberia as an example, users can search the database by country, region, agreement or conflict level. So this is really whether it's an interstate conflict or intrastate conflict or a mix of the two, or if it's a local agreement as well. But you can also search by category or issues. So this just demonstrates the huge variety of issues that parties need to come to some sort of agreement on to move out of conflict or to move towards talks. So we code for gender, issues, mentions of power sharing, human rights, if there's any mention of reforming the justice sector, the security sector, transitional justice. And we also refine slightly further down, so users can search regarding on how detailed they want to get. If we search, for example, something that this database demonstrated for us that we sort of were aware of from earlier research on peace processes, but this really demonstrates is just how many agreements it takes to move from conflict to some form of peace. So for Liberia, for example, you can see that throughout the peace process, 30 peace agreements were signed that we've collected here. And then what for each agreement with the coding, it then demonstrates to you precisely what those issues were and the provisions from the agreements. So what this does is it takes agreements that are often presented or communicated with the public, but also people outside of a conflict zone in very obscure terms. Often what's in the agreement can be sort of rushed over very quickly. What this does is it makes it very accessible to people, rather than just being something that people discuss without necessarily knowing precisely what the agreement does about a particular topic. And something that we've done that is really sort of demonstrates just how these peace processes are not linear in terms of progress, that there's a lot of going back and forth, there's a lot of stop-starting, often earlier agreements can be made and then broken, resulting in more violence. So one of our partnerships was with the School of Informatics and with the Bayes Institute, and Tobias Hagman developed this visualizing peace timeline. So what it shows you is, we thought about peace processes as being sort of very linear in their progress, that you have pre-negotiation agreements about what is going to be talked about, or you have a ceasefire building confidence so that then parties can make it to more comprehensive talks, and then an implementation agreement. This is what you would expect that to look like. And what we see is actually this is what progress of agreements across peace processes, this is what they look like from 1990 to mid-2020. So for example, if we click on, which ones? So this is the peace process in the Philippines-Mindanao conflict. And what this shows is that you've had a statement of understanding, you've gone up to, which is a pre-negotiation agreement, but then you have moved up to an implementation agreement, and then going back and forth you see a lot of going back and forth between pre-negotiation and ceasefire agreements, but also with a lot of implementation agreements and renewal agreements. So this really demonstrates to you just the idea of kind of going from a ceasefire to something comprehensive to that being implemented really rarely happens in real world peace processes. So the other thing that I want to show from the Pax Gender Peace Agreements database, so this is capturing all agreements that make references to women, girls, or gender. And here we've then further subcoded these for whether or not that relates to women's participation, particular groups of women, so for example, refugee women, or provisions to accommodate or deal with mothers, women prisoners, violence against women, or gender-based violence. So we capture that in this database, and this has then fed into the PeaceFem app, which we've developed. So we developed this in partnership with UN Women and the Monash Center for Gender, Peace and Security and Inclusive Peace. And what this app does is it pulls together the data from various projects in order to make the information that we have on Pax Gender much more accessible and available to women and gender equality advocates that are working to support women's meaningful inclusion in peace processes, and make that much more easier for them to access and to use. And what PeaceFem does is, well, our objectives of PeaceFem were to provide information about women's inclusion in peace processes for people to adapt to their own peace process and their own issues that they're having with women's inclusion in peace processes. But it's also to inspire people to see what's been done in other conflicts and then sort of use that inspiration to think more creatively about how they can push for women's inclusion in their own peace process. But also as a form of celebration, you know, throughout those peace processes and agreements that we have on PAX database, we know that women have been incredibly creative and determined to move those processes to a greater form of sustainable peace. So it's really important that we have a space where we can really see precisely what they did, what those constraints were, and what they still managed to achieve despite the constraints of that peace process. So we're hoping that PeaceFem is a step towards doing that. So what PeaceFem does is it combines the information that we have on the peace agreements that included women's provisions that relate to women. It includes information about the strategies that those women used, which comes from the Inclusive Peace Project and the Monash Project. What the factors were for supporting women's inclusion, what enabled them, what constrained them, and then also whether or not provisions for women's inclusion and gender provisions were implemented or not. So we have it's available in both English and Arabic because it was initially designed to support women in the MENA region. And it's about 50 megabytes to download. So it's pretty small, and it's available offline as well. So you can see here the various ways that you can search. It includes about 30 peace agreements at the moment, but we're looking at ways to expand that. You can also search through these visual options as well. And of course also in Arabic. So each peace agreement is an entry in the app, and each entry shows you what were the gender provisions of that particular agreement, what process it was, a conflict it was a part of, what strategies women in that context used in order to push for gender inclusion in the agreement and women's participation in the peace process, what the enabling and constraining factors were, and also it then links them to a timeline which shows other agreements in that process that also had gender provisions. So for example, the provisions screen will demonstrate that finer grained coding that I mentioned earlier. So if the agreement mentioned women's participation, what precisely was that provision? Was it something that was slightly vague and says, great, yes, women should be included in, you know, post-conflict institutions, in the parliament that we're about to form, or is it something that is much more specific about precisely how many women, what form of voting system will be used to get those women into the newly established parliament, for example? So we also have the strategies that women used in order to get themselves into the process, whether they were directly represented, whether they held mass demonstrations, whether there were any formal consultations with women's groups. So then the enabling and constraining factors. So whether, and those tend to be slightly more individual depending on the context rather than any specific categories. And then finally, it links then to a timeline that you can see. So for example, if this agreement did have a really strong section with gender provisions throughout the agreement, did other agreements that came later in the process, did they still have that, or was there a regression in terms of a mention of gender provisions in later agreements in that process, or did they build on earlier provisions that women had managed to get into the agreement? So I'm going to stop sharing there, and I'm going to just kind of finish by saying, like, why would you even need an app like this? Why do we have this? You know, we know from PACS that there are a huge number of agreements signed, but only 371 out of those 1,800 agreements make any reference to women, girls, and gender. And the data that comes out from other projects is that women are really underrepresented in these peace processes. So we hope that PeaceFem is one way of supporting all of the women that are out there currently already trying to push for women's meaningful participation in processes, to have some of that information that they can use to leverage their participation, that they can have that in a much more accessible format. So I'm going to stop there and pass on to Fiona, who's going to talk about what we've been doing with one of our PeaceTech tools that's been developed in response to the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, so the webinar today is called Can PeaceTech Stop Violence and Conflict Around the World? And one thing that we were aware of immediately when COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic is that conflict-affected countries might have a much greater challenge to tackle this pandemic. And so the background to our ceasefire tracker is that in March, the UN Secretary General actually recognized this grave challenge as well. And with that, he called for a global ceasefire on the 23rd of March to help the containment of COVID-19. This is the first time in recent decades that there has been a call for global ceasefire to tackle an infectious disease. And that's why we thought, you know, what happens now? Will there actually be a rise in ceasefires around the world? So we developed the COVID-19 ceasefires database around April, May. And that's because we found from developing PACS, the Peace Agreements database that we've heard about from Laura, is that there is a huge interest by researchers, peace builders, and policymakers all around the world to have a source that brings together all of these time-sensitive pieces of information. For example, agreement texts, as we also have on PACS, but on our tracker, they're tricky to find, and simply just keeping track of everything that's going on in the world is very time-consuming. And at the same time, we wanted to bring people's attention back to conflicts, because as you'll see from the tracker, even though ceasefires are being declared, they don't always hold. And generally speaking, violence around the world is very much still ongoing, even during the pandemic. So the ceasefire tracker is a database of ceasefire declaration and agreements. It also includes information on updates or related events, such as the termination or extension of a ceasefire during the period ever since March. And very interestingly, it shows data alongside live COVID-19 infection rates. So I'll start sharing my screen to show you the tracker on our website. The tool is available in 3 different formats, as you can see up here. We have a timeline. We have a search and browse function, which I'll get to in a second, and also the map function, which also has access to live infection rates from the Johns Hopkins repository. So as I said, we're not just tracking a ceasefire declaration, but also what happens after that, because we were looking at how comparatively small our set of data was, and we thought it'd be interesting to see what happens. Will ceasefires get extended? Will they hold? Will they be broken? Is there anything else that we want to mention? Down here we have a tracker of how many of them are declared at the moment, how many updates and related events we have in the tracker. And the timeline, for example, lets you filter. Here, the Philippines, for example, has a ceasefire from early March. We also provide some information on everything that's going on. And of course, here is a PDF of the text if we found one or if there is one. Most of them are available in English. You can also filter by agreement type. So for example, most of the ceasefires we have collected are unilateral, but there are also a few that are bilateral or multilateral, meaning that it's not just by one party that the ceasefire was declared, but actually between a set of parties, or between a party, a state party, and an armed actor. So yeah, one of the most recent ones, I actually collected that just last week. That was in Libya. So COVID-19 still gets mentioned in ceasefire declarations, although after May, we haven't seen the mention as much anymore. And here again, this is a bit more elaborate. The timeline was to show what happens in a particular conflict after a while. And here you can actually access sources plus the PDF text. And we've also added a link to past agreements on PACs. And here I'm getting to a very interesting part of the tracker. This is the map that will show you everywhere that a ceasefire or an update was declared. And we also have the COVID-19 infection rates shown here. This is live from the Johns Hopkins database. And this was really important for us because we didn't just want to bring in all the ceasefires, but we also wanted to put it into context. And for that, we actually had help from our PeaceTech fellow, Devanjan Bhattacharya, and he comes from a geomatic engineering background. He has interest in AI, using AI in peacebuilding contexts, and he was working with John Ellison, who is part of IT services of the University of Edinburgh. And the two of them together then combined our data with the API of that Johns Hopkins database. And what we've learned from putting this together is that we started collecting the agreements in early April and wanted to put this together quite early on, but it takes time. It takes time to communicate between us and people from tech backgrounds, and then also telling each other what we exactly wanted. For example, the map, we wanted it to show all of the different types of agreements in different colors, and then pulling in the data and the way it's shown here, you can toggle it in and out, but you can also just see it in much more detail. And that means that even though we wanted to be quick, of course, there was a lot of back and forth between us and the people from the relevant backgrounds. But it's been very interesting because all of the other projects, they've been in the making for much longer, while the ceasefire trackers was a very time sensitive one that we wanted to publish as soon as possible. So I'll stop sharing. Just to say that we've developed this together with other research programs. It wasn't just us at the University of Edinburgh. We also had help from Mediator, from the ETH Zurich, from the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, Organization Conciliation Resources, and the United States Institute of Peace. But we've also been in talks with the United Nations Department for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, meaning that, you know, there were lots of people with their expertise coming in to help to provide text. At the same time, we had people on the tech side to get this all underway, because as much as we from a non-STEM background want it to go live immediately, there's a lot of work that we have yet to understand. And this is actually where the three of us, Christine, Laura, and myself, come in. We want to be able to communicate between the people with the expertise and on the ground and the people with the tech backgrounds who can develop the things, the solutions that we are seeking. And that's very complex and difficult, but also very exciting. And I'll finish my part here, and I think we're moving on to some questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you very much for those presentations. They were really interesting. So my first question, these questions are directed to all three of you, so anyone who wants to jump in, and then you can all take a turn, or just one person. So what did you learn from this entire experience?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've learned so many things. I suppose on the level of the actual data, I think, I first started collecting peace agreements in the early 1990s. I was a human rights activist doing quite a lot of work in the Northern Ireland. I grew up there during the conflict. And of course, whenever peace negotiations started, we sort of, as human rights advocates and constituencies that were sort of trying to broaden and deepen the type of agreement that the government and the armed groups might sign, and the politicians even, most of whom hadn't been able to resolve the conflict for 30 years. We just immediately wanted to know, how do people write these? What do they put in them? Are there any examples out there? So I started collecting peace agreements really because they were sort of, for me, maybe as a lawyer, precedents, you know, kind of ways. And then I began to sort of be very surprised with just how many. I knew of some big peace processes. So around the early 1990s, South Africa was starting on its peace process. There was the Oslo Accord signed between Israel and Palestine. And I knew about these ones, but actually what I found was lots of places I had never even heard of before had really interesting peace agreements. Some of those places I've been very involved in since that time. One of them is Bougainville in Papua New Guinea. So that sort of has always surprised me. I think the other thing is that we're not really interested in peace agreements as documents, we are, but we're interested actually in how do we compare processes of change. On the tech end, I think what surprised me is quite hard to bring together the capacities that you need to deliver a product. And maybe this is obvious to all of you, but you know, we and I think we've got much better at creating the type of conversation that's needed. So often the way we work is through a very detailed spec where we say this is what we want, and then often we sit down with the tech collaborators, and sometimes actually the idea comes very much through a workshop where we say this is what we're trying to capture, and then, you know, brainstorm ideas. And often the people with the tech expertise, whether it's data visualizers or database designers, will say, well, we can do this and this, and then we will say, well, that's not maybe what people need to know. They need to know this. Could we change this around? So there's very much a kind of back and forward collaboration. And a thing that has surprised me is we seem to, very first time we got the database designed and the back end of it designed to input the information, we spent months and months and months on a spec. And I just thought, oh, this is going to take years then to get the thing. But then actually the database was produced in 3 weeks, and it was produced to very nearly right first time because we'd spent so long figuring out exactly how to do it. So that has, I think, been a learning curve for us.
So I guess as one of the researchers who started out doing the coding of peace agreements and then entering it into the back end, I think I've learned just how time consuming it is. Not obviously the research itself takes time, but the finessing of the back end in terms of what users want, as Christine said, the sort of the structure and the database was there, it was ready to go, but then over time and having that conversation constantly with information services and with John Allison, particularly coming from a researcher perspective, what researchers expect and what they want to know, how policymakers want to use our database, how people doing quantitative research want to use our database. Everybody's coming to it with very different expectations of what they expect to find, what's most useful for them, how easy it is for them to access it. So it's very much been an iterative process of constantly improving with each release of the data, because we update. So that's something that our data manager, Sanya Badanyak, has spent a lot of time working on. And I often find that other academic researchers in politics don't understand how much time and work it takes to get that to be sort of there and ready for them to use. We get a lot of requests from other similar projects working on, want to create a similar database to PACS, and often there's an expectation that it's a lot easier and faster to do that phase of it than really it does take. So we're sort of constantly saying to them, you really need to get the right people and you really need to invest in that time, because it took us longer to, press publish than we hoped and anticipated, but it was so much better once we finally got to that stage, because we'd spent all of that time thinking about who was going to use it and how they were going to access it.
One thing that I've learned while working on PeaceTech, I've only come into the program last year, spent some time on looking into what other things are out there, and the potential of using technologies and applying them to peace building purposes is really huge. And they're just interesting things like using mobile data to estimate population displacement after a natural disaster or during a conflict, or using prediction methods, using AI to model displacement. I've also come across something like an early warning system in Syria that was working with crowdsourcing, but also with some other methods, and just thinking of what we could be doing, what we could be achieving if people came together and had these conversations is quite exciting. At the same time, we can't forget what can go wrong when you use technologies. And I think that was a big process for me to learn about that, because I was first really excited about all this potential. And then I realized, instant messaging, for example, has potential to ruin a whole peace process if someone is spreading false news over a WhatsApp message, for example. And that has actually happened in a peace talk in Yemen, and people just walked out of the room because the message they got was wrong. So yeah, there are things that we have to keep in mind.
That's great, thanks guys. So the next question, probably more for Fiona than anyone, but how can PeaceTech be used to support women's meaningful participation in peace processes and gender-sensitive peace agreements?
Yeah, so we've actually looked into this when we developed the PeaceFem app, because we wanted to produce something that would actually be beneficial to the women mediators on the ground. And we came to the conclusion that PeaceTech, first of all, needs to tackle risks that are associated with using technologies. For example, the becoming a target, which is a big issue for everyone who works in peace building. If you are in a conflict setting where someone will follow up or track you, then using technology might make you a bigger target. And gender-specific issue is online gender-based violence. So everything that we experience as women on a daily basis in real life can also be replicated online. And there are things like stalking or human trafficking that starts online. And I have read about peace builders who were, speaking out on platforms like Twitter, which, by the way, is named the most toxic platform for women online. And they were just facing so much hate on these platforms because they are women, because they were speaking out. So this is a really big responsibility of a PeaceTech tool to support women. But we also said, you know, PeaceTech can help them in making sense of information out there, big data, all of this, you know, the abundance of data that's out there. And it can help them build on existing knowledge, create platforms and networks, facilitate decision-making through AI methods and algorithms, for example. And we hope that it will enable more women who previously were not able or excluded to effectively participate in peace building. When they're using a PeaceTech tool, they should find themselves empowered and not further disempowered, because that is already the biggest issue for women in peace building.
Thank you. And we actually have a question from one of the participants, so I'm going to read that out. On the ceasefire in a time of COVID-19, may I ask what could be the relationship between the pandemic and the ceasefire? Are there strong relationships between the severity of the pandemic and the progress of ceasefire, promptly or slowly?
I think there was a lot of expectation was created by the UN Secretary General's call in March that because of this, just the unprecedented threat of COVID-19, particularly spreading in conflict zones where there's more restrictive access to hand washing facilities, already, decimated healthcare systems, capacities for getting aid and healthcare workers in and out of conflict zones, IDP camps, that sort of the severe threat would be recognized and would be enough to bring parties to stop fighting, whether temporarily or permanently. Obviously, this hasn't quite happened, but that was potentially slightly unrealistic expectation anyway. There's been so many different relationships between what's happened in conflict zones and the pandemic, but it's very difficult in some instances to demonstrate whether a ceasefire has been called because of the pandemic, even if it's been cited as a reason by parties in the ceasefire that they recognize the threat that COVID-19 poses to their populations. There are also many other reasons that parties will agree to a ceasefire. They will agree to a ceasefire in one place in order to kind of, shore up resources to then fight, say, another armed group in another part of the country. Or they will use it to kind of leverage some recognition as a legitimate conflict party. So it's very difficult to tell what are the motivations for somebody declaring a ceasefire during the pandemic. Also because some of the ceasefires that have been declared, they were part of processes that were ongoing prior to the pandemic. So in some cases, like in South Sudan, the group of the opposition forces there said that they were going to just extend a pre-existing ceasefire that had been agreed earlier in the year. Something that we've also seen a lot of is that the pandemic has just made conflict worse, even in contexts where there's been discussions around having a ceasefire. So, attacks on healthcare workers have continued, attacks on healthcare facilities have continued. In Yemen, they're currently battling 3 to 4 different infectious diseases. This is not the first disease outbreak in a conflict zone that healthcare workers on the ground are battling with. And we also see that peacebuilders are often now forming sort of first responder roles. So, and local peacebuilders as well, because of the access restrictions on international healthcare workers or humanitarian workers, that local people are sort of taking charge with the relief efforts. But we've seen that always in peacebuilding, that with some of those bigger agreements that were being signed, and sort of, the world's media and attention was on those with international statespeople. A lot of the work to get to that moment had been done by local activists, local peacebuilders, local women, local healthcare workers. So local peacebuilders sort of responding to the pandemic is nothing really new in that respect.
We've got another question from an attendee.
Hi, this is Agnieszka from the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders. And since I have the mic, let me first of all just say thank you and congratulations. I've also played around with the PeaceFem app before, and I think it's really excellent, and it was really interesting to hear a little bit more about the process that has gone into creating the tool. And I'm sure it can be hugely helpful and including to some of the women peacebuilders that we work with. So thank you for that. But my question was around, and I know it's a difficult one, and I know you won't have ready-made answers, but I was just hoping to start a discussion on the digital gap, right? So we know the access to technology is not equal everywhere. And we've noticed that with the pandemic, our partners in South Sudan, for example, who previously would have been maybe a little bit more able to use technology and engage with it, wouldn't be able to do it now because many women, rely on going to internet cafes, right, to use internet, and they can't do that now. And we also know that the digital gap is gendered, right? So where there is limited access to technology, to a computer, to a cell phone, or to internet data, it will be more limited for women than it is for men, like so many things. So I was just wondering, in your work and engagement with the PeaceTech and particularly with using technology to support women's meaningful participation in peace processes and peace building, have you come across any examples of good practices or of ways that this can be mitigated, if not overcome?
One of the things that was interesting when we started not just doing our own PeaceTech, but looking at what people were calling PeaceTech, was that actually they were including a very broad sense of technology. And I think that's in ways another thing that I've learned, both with data and with tech applications. You're often best, I think we like to think, and maybe coming from more the science perspective, I don't know if you find this, we sort of think of these really complicated things we can do, but actually the starting point always has to be, what's the easiest, simplest way to do this? And only moving on to more elaborate ways if you can't do it the simple way. So to me, it seems that some of the practices for reaching out have been, and I know this has been used in South Sudan, accompanying different tech platforms with also radio, etc. And I think one of the quite good things is the sort of ways in which often there are creative communities that cut across, people that will actually be in local communities doing plays and things, and other people using more technical applications. There are some examples of, this happened I think in Bougainville, of actually some of the tech and phone companies being prepared to sort of, through their pro bono wings and their philanthropic sides, being prepared to make applications available. So the phone companies in Bougainville, when there was a big referendum, did a lot of, simple SMS tech messaging, and most people do have a simple phone there. There is a difference between men and women, but it's not completely stark. And there are sort of examples of giving technology to people. In fact, one of my own experiences that I suppose led me to believe in the technology was for a period where there was a lot of violence associated with marches in Northern Ireland. We were given a video camera by a group called Witness, and that meant that we were able to video things and document in a different way. So just that simple act of giving us a video camera meant we could use the tech. So I think some of those happen, but also I think there's divisions within women. So even where women, say somewhere like Yemen, often don't have access to mobile phones, only have it through men. There are often diaspora communities who do have good tech access and also have to use tech, because there's no way really to group as women when you have been spread to the four winds the way women in places like Yemen and Syria have. So often there are at least some constituencies of women who can be enabled through the tech. So I suppose what I would say is the good practice is not relying on one way of communicating, but spreading across different forms of communication and different ways of engaging, right from in-person consultations to, SMS polling, which can be done in really low bandwidth, to more elaborate submissions online, and all of these sort of trying to have them impact on peace negotiations.
So I can ask the next question, and yeah, everyone, the participants continue sending questions in the chat as they arise, and we'll definitely address them. So I think you guys touched on this a little bit in your presentations, but how important is it to be working in an interdisciplinary team? So with yourselves not being scientists and working with people who are scientists, how has that experience been, and how important is it?
So important. It's important in ways that you don't even realize until you start doing it. So a really funny example that always makes me laugh when this happens when we're communicating with people is that in a lot of social science disciplines and humanities disciplines, coding means something very different to me and to my fellow researchers than it does to somebody who's developing something. So even really basic things like the terminology that you're using, you really have to stop and think, if I'm writing coding in this email, is that going to massively confuse the person that I'm sending it to because they think that I'm asking them for something that I'm not? What's also really interesting is the creativity that happens when you're engaging with people from outside of your discipline. That's why it's so great to be invited to take part in this conversation today, is that it really challenges you to then look back at your own research and think about why you're doing it, how you're doing it, what questions you're asking. Are those really the right questions that you were asking within your own data, let alone thinking about how you're communicating that? So it's hugely important, and it's just, I can only see it as beneficial.
Maybe to come in, I think one of the other things just to point out is it's sort of not just interdisciplinary, but background, if you like. So it's sort of a three-way conversation nearly between us that are sort of doing the sort of more legal social sciences analysis, between the tech people who are doing, helping us with the applications. But the third really important constituency are people actually working in the field. So in our wider research program, we don't just have academic organizations, but peacebuilding organizations, for example, Conciliation Resources. And those sort of work very closely with networks of local peacebuilders on the ground. And the Ceasefire, COVID-19 Ceasefire app's a really good example of that, because really how it originated was that we were interested in what was going on, but we were invited into a group by our peacebuilding partners, which brought together people from the UN mediation unit and from countries in conflict, particularly Colombia, because one of the responses immediately was from Colombia. So a whole lot of individuals came together. And that was where, because that keeps us very rooted in what is in need on the ground that we're addressing. And then we have to think, well, where can comparative research be useful to that need on the ground? And then the tech pieces, how can we make that available in easy access ways? And the idea is that it's a sort of constant loop where then people use it on the ground and say, well, that was really useful, but it would be more useful if it did this, or could it do this as well? So, for example, we hadn't planned to put the COVID-19, the infections data. It was just a ceasefire tracker. And then actually one of the people from US Institute of Peace said, it'd be really interesting to see where the ceasefires are in relation to how bad infections are. And then we sort of were able to come up with a technical solution to how we drew the API from the Johns Hopkins site onto our website. And then we'll be meeting with that group again and seeing, like, do we want to develop that tool more or not? So I think that's, for me, sort of quite interesting, that I kind of see us as a bridge between the technical piece, but also people trying to sort of create their own solutions to conflict on the ground, for whom comparative data can be just one tool that's helpful to them.
I actually have a personal anecdote that illustrates to me how important it is to have this interdisciplinary conversation. So my partner has a PhD in data science, and during the pandemic, obviously, we've been working from home. So often in breaks, we have conversations about the work that we're doing, and then I explain a problem that I've read about. And sometimes it's about, measuring for the Sustainable Development Goals where poverty has improved and we're not, and how difficult it is to get people, with limited resources. And he says, I could put together an algorithm that can calculate where at what time it would be best to send someone, and that would make everything, potentially easier. And I often just sit there saying, oh, you can do that. So that, to me, explains how good it is to just have people in the same room having these conversations. They don't even need to be focused, it's just brainstorming what's even possible, explaining to each other what in our areas is a matter that we're talking about, because I found that I don't know what's even possible, and people from AI and tech backgrounds, they don't know what kind of problems we're dealing with and what they could offer as solutions to us. So yeah, we would be really keen on having a PeaceTech hub, so to speak, where you bring together people from all of these disciplines to work on a daily basis, interdisciplinary, with each other, to have these, you know, creative ideas flowing a bit more.
Yeah, thanks for that, guys. We're running out of time, or we're pretty much out of time. So just one last quick question for you. If anyone is interested in learning more about PeaceTech, or wants to kind of any advice on how to get into PeaceTech, do you have any advice for them, or any resources or anything like that that they could look at?
Maybe just look at our website. We've some things up, but we're going to be writing up our own, but what PeaceTech is, so that will be up really soon. And if any of you, I mean, if we ever have jobs on offer, we put them up, but if any of you wanting to know more, collaborate, yeah, we're always sort of willing to talk. Quite a lot of our collaborations, you know, happened initially. We didn't really have any budget. We went into data speed dating workshops and met people, and we find that finding people that talk our language in some way across the interdisciplinary divide is really important. So I suppose we're not really set up to be women in PeaceTech, but quite a lot of the researchers who've sort of had the passion for it, including the three of us, have been women. Quite a lot of the tech people we work with from informatics are men, so there is the digital divide in who's having what bit of the conversation. Looking at what peace building organisations are doing is quite interesting, and hopefully we'll have references to that in our data. One of the things we find is just the term can be so broad that it can mean everything and anything, and kind of lose its meaning. But I mean, if anyone's sort of interested or wants to sort of play around with our data in some way, or has interested in applications, we're always sort of open to hearing that, provided I guess we weren't flooded, but that usually doesn't happen. And then I think looking around what other organisations are doing, because the interesting thing is we got very into this well before COVID, just because we actually really enjoyed the interdisciplinary collaboration and the potential of it. But of course, now a lot of our stuff in the field can't be done that way. So we're now doing our research through remote surveys, trying to understand what were happening. Our partners in the field through remote, we did very quick remote surveys. And we then found, I had initially also been keen to do more because, you know, with climate change and things, we were aware we can't just be flying around places. We have to just find new ways to work. And of course, now we've had to fast track that with the pandemic. I think in some senses, everybody now, you know, we don't really have to win the argument for PeaceTech anymore in the pandemic, because everybody's having to use Zoom and things that, you know, us and our partners were already using. In that sense, I think if you look at the peace building organisations, you'll see they all do have needs, and that maybe some of you that are thinking about working and have some time maybe from a commercial job, some time and support from your company to do pro bono work, or maybe you're looking to use your tech to sort of do a particular good thing in the world. It's just to say, I think this is an application, and it's a very fun application. You know, it has a lot of impact. So our data is one small little thing of PeaceTech, but it's used by armed groups, by women's groups in the field, it's used by the UN, it's used by the FCO and DFID. And in fact, people then sort of come to us and say, what has been done on this area? And we put a piece of analysis around it. But we're able to have global data very, very quickly, and often making an impact in a peace process requires almost in-time advice and in-time research to be made available to new problems. So, you know, somebody will say, well, there's talk of trying to create a safe zone. Has anyone ever done that? And then we'll have to be able to go to the data and see and give some examples. So it's just, again, it's a very relevant, useful thing.
Yeah, sadly our time is up. You could have asked so many more questions. Yeah, so just thank you so much to all of the panelists. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. And thank you to Elizabeth as well. This is our final WiSTEM Connect series event. So yeah, thank you for Elizabeth for all your help with this series. Yeah, thanks. Have a nice day.
Thanks
so much for having us. Thanks so
you.
much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much for your time.